Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation, and you'll detect an American accent, I suspect. And that's partly because for many years I worked for the U.S. government, and as your chair says, quite rightly, I don't represent them. I haven't for almost a decade now. I don't represent anybody except myself, my own views, but necessarily my views are influenced by my experience and what I think I have learned, or what I think worked and what I think does not. And it is colored in particular by my involvement on behalf of the U.S. government in the 1980s and 1990s in managing the American cultural participation, or lack of it, in South Africa. And I think that informs, to some degree, my sense of what is the right thing to do now for circumstances now in various places, or for the future. I think it's important to start out by saying that there are views that are different about the nature of the purposes of art in its international dimension. For some people, of course, art is for art's sake. The artist, the individual, creates what they're going to create, and the circumstances beyond that are not their problem. They belong to the audience's problem. There are other people, of course, who argue that art, culture, performance is necessarily a weapon of a struggle, and it can be a variety of struggles, and Mike has listed a number of them, and I don't want to refer to them, to list them again. Historically, at least, the very notion of a cultural boycott against South Africa dates back to the early 1950s in its explicit form. The late Reverend Trevor Huddleston proposed a cultural boycott against South Africa. He also proposed an economic and a sports one at the same time. But even Huddleston recognized that art and culture were tools and not simply blunt instruments. And one story from his time in Johannesburg, even though he was a proponent of a boycott, when he learned that the British violinist Yehudi Menuhin was coming to Johannesburg, through a friend of a friend of a friend, he made contact with Menuhin and said, I know where you're performing, and I know this isn't fair and right to the rest of the country. Will you come with me to my church in Sophiatown and perform there? And he did, and Huddleston very clearly decided that it was in the nature of things that they confront the government of the day, and they deliberately invited, word of mouth, mail, people of all backgrounds. The doors were wide open, the windows were open, there were hundreds of people inside the church, many more outside. Even at that beginning of the process, it was clear to its proponent, its father, its progenitor, that you use culture as a way of getting something to happen rather than simply to punish a society for whatever purposes. By the end of the 1980s, even the African National Congress in exile had reconciled itself with an understanding that a blanket one-size-all policy was less than useful. This led, in turn, to the establishment of the so-called cultural desks that vetted, that approved or disapproved performers coming into the country or going out. But arbitrary and odd choices sometimes happen. An observation I would make from that is that a blanket boycott by its nature becomes a very blunt instrument. There is always what I would refer to as collateral damage. Within the US government, we looked for our programmatic niche, what we could do with American groups, with American performers who either were planning to come to South Africa for performances or who would be invited, because by 1992 it was very clear there was a very different horizon to look towards. But we decided that necessarily we would insist upon a whole range of ideas, a whole range of connections, of support, of outreach, of performance, reaching into the society rather than simply performing for audiences. And the lesson we drew from this was that one uses culture as a tool for a particular purpose, that is better democracy, more democracy, less restriction, etc. Now move forward to just a little while ago, a year and a half ago or so, when the Cape Town Opera from this country was planning its trip to Israel to perform the American opera, George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. And the argument that I wrote about was 4 parts. The first part was, why not, and as a journalist I could make recommendations, whether people would take them or not was their business, but I could at least state my position of what I thought was the right thing to do. That the question was important as to why not use the trip to reach out to groups and build on the idea of reconciliation, which is a theme that is close to the heart of most South Africans, but force the issue of that precise discussion. Second, one should make sure that any performance, workshop, etc., is open to all proactively, not simply a little tiny sign in the window, everybody who wishes to come can come, but you make sure that the effort itself is designed from the outset to be open to all. That the organizers and the performers should make it incumbent upon themselves to encourage those who otherwise would not be able to or would think they could not come to attend, that the sponsoring organizations should be forced among themselves to consider the intent of their own actions. What must they do to make sure that condition prevailed? And finally, one needed to remember that not everybody in a country, not everybody in the arts and culture of a country is necessarily a spokesman for their country's current particular political policies. If that is true, then should boycotts unilaterally and unequivocally affect them as well? I'll give you one example, which goes back to the late 1980s in this country. 2 artists, Mbongeni Ngema and Johnny Clegg, both names familiar to most people, both were going to perform in Europe. And the then existing cultural desk and exile groups said that Mbongeni Ngema was more than welcome, but that Johnny Clegg was not. And the distinction as to why the two should be different eluded me, and I think it eluded Johnny Clegg as well, because it would be hard to explain what he had done individually. Put the position in the case of Israel, think of theater people such as Moti Lerner and Noam Semmel, who have been vocal and active in their dissent from the nature of their government's current and particular policies. A boycott, should it affect their right to travel, to perform, should it affect their right to do the things that they feel as an artist to do. Having said all of that, let me offer one other historical observation, well, 2 actually. Some years ago, you may remember in Austria, Jörg Haider, the neo-Nazi leader, gained a significant share of political power in a coalition government he effectively headed. There very quickly arose within Europe opposition to his presence in government, and because of the particular nature of Austrian society, tourism affects perhaps 15% of the country's GDP, and cultural tourism is a major portion of that. People do want to see the castles, the music, and so forth. The Salzburg Festival became a topic of some import to people. There was an increasingly strong boycott of the Salzburg Festival. Individuals who had been invited refused to participate, refused to offer their funds, refused to be cultural ambassadors on its behalf. But the circumstances of Austria are very different than they are in most countries. You'll find it very rare to find a society anywhere where 15% or so of that country's entire gross domestic product resides in its tourism and cultural tourism. But the question then leads us to, if Israel, if South Africa, if Austria, why not, and where is the pressure for a boycott of North Korea? North Korea clearly is a repressive society. 500,000 people or more are in prison. Very few people get the right to have 3 square meals a day, let alone 2. Freedom of expression is non-existent. Right to travel is virtually nil. Why is there no cultural boycott of North Korea? And at the same time, all countries practically in the world are trying to use culture as a way of reaching into that society. The New York Philharmonic, for example, took several years to arrange a trip to North Korea with the willingness of virtually everybody else to allow that to happen. If not North Korea, China. China has prisoners in factories. China has children in factories. The Tibetans don't particularly think China's civil rights policy is effective and appropriate. Why not Saudi Arabia? 50.1% of Saudis are unable to drive a car, unable to vote, unable to have any expression. Why not Cuba? Some people may think Cuba is an appropriate, useful place. Freedom of expression in Cuba is limited too. The question of a cultural boycott, then, is more complicated than simply that society is doing bad things to some of its people. I want to close with just a quote from one of the artists who chose to go to Swaziland's bushfire festival, even though the boycott was announced. And this is Philippa Yaa de Villiers, the poet and writer. Artists are like doctors who minister to the emotional and spiritual needs of people, no matter what their color or creed. If I am called somewhere to present my poetry, I go. I have been to the Harare International Festival of the Arts. I have been to the Havana International Festival of Poetry. I've been to the United Kingdom and performed there. All of these regimes have moments of grand larceny and oppression. South Africa, too, has its own post-liberation embarrassments. And she concludes this letter by saying, finally, I'd like to say something about this conscience question. Part of the coercive tactic of getting people to join the cultural boycott is playing into the fear of the repercussions. If I go, I won't be popular anymore. Nobody will see any merit in my work. It would be the end of my career. These are all practical concerns, but are they really my conscience? Is that all that my conscience is, the question of what they will think of me as an artist? And I think we're left with the question then, how to use culture as a tool and a tactic to change a society. If so, which societies and what kinds of change are we after? And then what do we do with the circumstances of the collateral damage that happens? And if all of those questions are still answered, do we really have the right to make the individual distinction, this society versus that society, this country versus another? I'll wait to hear other comments and questions from you out there, my colleagues on the panel, and we look forward to a good discussion.